everyone, in this video we are going to do a very brief history of the novel and its evolution, its start to contemporary day, what it looks like, what the characteristics are, how they've evolved over time. So let's jump right into the beginnings of the structure that we call a novel now. The first novel started to appear in England in the early 1700s, and there were a few things that led up to this that we'll talk about in a moment. If you are wondering, well, why weren't there any novels until the early 1700s? That's lots and lots of years without any novels in it. The most simple answer to that question is that drama was the dominant artistic form. If you think about the world pre-1700s, we had an illiterate society that didn't read, and if you can't read, novels aren't super helpful. So a lot of art was conveyed through drama, where it was performed and you could listen and watch rather than having to be literate. The things that changed that made novels a more forceful form of artistic perspective was first and foremost the printing press. The printing press led to progress towards universal literacy because people had more access to written literature of all sorts. Pamphlets, brochures, and of course longer things like novels that didn't have to be handwritten by monks in a monastery, for example. There were other conditions that also helped to change artistic endeavors towards the novel. Two really important ones were the English Civil War and the establishment of Parliament, because the English Civil War and the establishment of Parliament ultimately led to democratic ideals being the mainstream popular belief. And part of democratic ideals in the time period were education should be universal, and reading is a part of the educational process. So we want to have a literate society that is well educated and well-rounded as we get later into education. So because education was something that everybody was encouraged to receive, reading was a part of that education. More people can read, you can have longer texts like novels. All right, so let's talk about what these novels were like. The very early novels were moralistic and didactic. Didactic is a really important word that hopefully you know from maybe 10th grade when you were reading some of the early works of the time period of British literature. Didactic means designed to instruct. So if you are being given instructions or a lesson directly, you're supposed to learn something from it, like morals, for example. That is didactic in nature. It's trying to teach you something. So the early novels were often about instructing people on moral behavior. In England, where this is largely starting, of course that meant in terms of Christian morals. There were a few characteristics that I'd like for you to be able to identify with these early novels. The first is that the early novels were character-based writings. All of the characters were very round and complete. You didn't necessarily have lots of characters. It was more about developing each of the characters that you did have in the story. The early novels also used to try to get this impression of verisimilitude, or this sense of being real. Verisimilitude is another really important word for you to know, and it means truth or seeming to be truthful. So if we're looking for the impression of verisimilitude in these early novels, we're looking for ways that the authors were trying to make the novels feel like nonfiction, like real stories, rather than these elaborate fictional pieces that we think of today when we think of novels. A lot of these early authors did that through two particular forms or structures in their novels. A lot of people formed their novels to be epistolary, meaning in a letter format, so it would be letters back and forth, correspondences between the characters, and also in a diary form. So you would have a novel that was a diary from one character's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the early novels were very moralistic in tone because they were designed to be didactic in nature. In the late 18th century, after novels kind of got going, Gothic novels became extremely popular. And Gothic novels were all about exploring the inner psychological turmoil of characters. So they began to focus within a character instead of on lots of characters that were all very well-rounded. Some good examples of that are basically everything by Edgar Allan Poe is Gothic. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if you've ever read that, is another great example. And Frankenstein is also about that inner turmoil of our thoughts and our conscience and things like that. In the early 19th century, I want to highlight Jane Austen. She was a prolific writer who wrote a lot of satire, and a lot of times her work isn't considered satire by the general population, but it absolutely was if you look in the context of the time period she was writing in. Her work in particular was all about exposing and mocking the silliness, the follies of her time period, that age. In particular, she focused on the middle upper classes. She was very critical of the way things were in society, especially as it relates to young women and marriage and those sorts of structures that society had in place. She created this satire and this mockery by using a very comedic tone and ridiculing those that focused on just the trivial things. If you have ever read or seen any of the versions of Pride and Prejudice, you can see Elizabeth is a great example of that because she is very progressive in terms of what she wants and how she goes about getting it. She's not falling into the follies that, like her mother, Mrs. Bennet, does about being so worried about getting married and having children and being wealthy. And she doesn't care so much about that, which is a pretty big digression from what most women in upper middle classes were trying to do in that time period. When we move into the 19th century, so we're talking about the 1800s here, when Jane Austen was writing, our character-based writings are going to evolve a little bit. We're not going to have the completely round, complete characters anymore. The relationships are going to be more through a dialogue than just description of each of these people and what they're doing and that development. You're going to see a reproduction of life on page, so there's still an element of verisimilitude because we're telling realistic stories. There are going to be details and dates and regional settings, so maybe we're going to set our story in London and we're going to use dates of when a fair comes to town. There are going to be little details that are authentic to the setting and what life is like in that real setting to create that verisimilitude. The setting, as I've said, is going to be really important because it does set up that realistic purpose, making you feel like you are in a real place, not reading a work of fiction. And it's a reflection on the human turmoil in a lot of these novels. If it is a really if you have a character who's feeling dark and brooding and troubled, then you're going to see stormy weather, and those kinds of things are going to start to come out in the 19th century novels. You're also going to see a social conscience, and this is kind of what I was talking about with Jane Austen, though she's a little more on the satirical side of things. A lot of the literature in the 19th century was about drawing attentions to inequalities. So looking at the inequality that women face and children and the poor, the impoverished, all of those inequalities and differences are going to be highlighted in a lot of the literature that was coming out of the 1800s as people are questioning, like, is this right that these people are treated in this way? And there's going to be a huge interest in the inner machinations of the characters. So rather than it just being about the social world and how we're interacting with the people around us, there's this huge interest now on what is going on within me psychologically as a protagonist in a story. All right, so let's jump to modern novels. We're talking about the 1900s here, the 20th century. As I said, we are going to start evolving towards this inner world piece. It started in the 19th century. It continued in the 20th, where the thoughts and reactions of an individual character are going to be used a lot more than dialogue overall. It's going to be more about the within as we get more contemporary. In the modernist period, this is when stream of consciousness came about. The stream of consciousness technique of storytelling is nonlinear. So just like when you are just kind of thinking to yourself and going through maybe what you have to do, you kind of go here and there. So if you're trying to think through a to-do list, but maybe one of the things in your to-do list reminds you about something completely unrelated, and then you kind of digress into that other thought for a while and then come back to your to-do list again, that's stream of consciousness. It's just kind of that nonlinear progression of thought that we all have in a novel, in terms of the writing style and the structure and chronology of the novel. They're non-chronological. You are going to get a much darker view of the world in modernist novels. There's a preoccupation with evil that really starts to come out, and the dark side of mankind. This is largely because of all of the stuff that was happening in the early 1900s. You've got 2 world wars, you've got the Depression. All that badness is really going to start making authors think and write about, like, is mankind really evil and messed up? Or, like, what's happening here? Why are all of these dark, horrible things happening? Is there really any good in the world? Or is this just life that we are stuck living? And this is also where we're going to see the questioning of the existence of God. You've probably talked in your history classes, I hope, about moral relativism, about doing what's good in this situation, or situational ethics. All of that is tied into this historical context of what's happening in the first half of the 20th century, and that beginning of having literature that questions those dark things that people are thinking about because of what's going on in the world around them. I also want to point out the shifting that's happening. Point of view and narrative voice is going to start shifting within novels in the 1900s. What I mean by that is that you're going to have multiple points of view now. So maybe we're not going to follow one character the entire story. Maybe we're going to have a chapter by one character and then the next is by another. So we're going to have that shifting start to happen, and that multiple perspectives and the thoughts of those characters individually. You're going to see that a lot in first-person perspective, but also third-person limited perspective, where in a chapter we're focusing just on the thoughts and knowledge of that one character for that short time before it changes to someone else. And again, the setting is going to often be symbolic. If it's hot for a reason. If it's raining for a reason. If they're in a big city and it's smoggy, that big city claustrophobic feeling, it's all going to be symbolic, maybe of how a character is doing emotionally or psychologically, or some larger purpose is often going to be conveyed or supplemented through the setting. All right, so that's all of that, so we'll pause here.